Eleanor Ashford's fingers traced the spines of her father's leather-bound books, dust particles dancing in the amber light, filtering through the library windows of what had once been the finest house in Charleston. The Ashford estate had grown silent in the 6 years since her father's death. Not the peaceful silence of retirement, but the suffocating quiet of a home, abandoned by fortune and society. The wallpaper, once adorned with intricate patterns of gold leaf, now peeled in delicate strips like the shed skin of something dying slowly. She straightened a stack of correspondence on the desk, all marked "overdue" in harsh red ink, and allowed herself a small, bitter smile. The world had forgotten Eleanor Ashford, and perhaps that was a mercy. The morning her father had collapsed in the House of Representatives 17 years ago, Eleanor had been only 23. She remembered the servants' faces as they carried him from the carriage, the way her mother had gripped Eleanor's arm so tightly it left bruises shaped like crescents. She remembered the doctors, the fever, the final labored breaths. What she did not remember clearly, because it had all happened so quickly, was how easily their world had crumbled. Her father had been building a coalition to challenge a man named Nathaniel Hartwell, a railroad magnate whose reach extended through every significant business venture in the state. Thomas Ashford had discovered irregularities in Hartwell's contracts, suspected fraudulent dealings that had left dozens of investors ruined. Thomas had gathered evidence, compiled documents, prepared to expose the network of corruption that had been woven through Charleston's highest echelons of power. 3 weeks before he could present his findings, Thomas Ashford suffered a stroke. Whether it had been truly accidental remained, in Eleanor's mind, an open question she had learned not to voice aloud. Nathaniel Hartwell had consolidated his power unchallenged. The Ashford properties had been seized for unpaid taxes that seemed to multiply impossibly. Eleanor's mother had retreated into a widow's mourning that eventually consumed her entirely. She had died in this house 5 years ago, leaving Eleanor alone with the weight of family history and the burden of everything her father had been unable to complete. Eleanor had survived through teaching music to the children of families who still remembered her father with fondness, through taking in needlework for church ladies who pitied her circumstances, through the careful economics of a life stripped of luxury, but not yet stripped of dignity. She lived in 2 rooms of the Ashford house, the library and a small adjacent chamber, and kept the rest of the mansion sealed, a monument to what had been. On the morning that changed everything, Eleanor had been transcribing a student's piano exercise when old Mrs. Henderson arrived at the library door with news. The servants were not sure how Mrs. Henderson had managed to enter the house. Eleanor had not heard the bell ring. The elderly woman simply appeared, breathless and red-faced, her fan clutched so tightly in one hand that its ivory frame had cracked. "You must hear this," Mrs. Henderson had said, sinking into the chair Eleanor offered without being asked. "The Duke, that detestable man, that Nathaniel Hartwell, he has proposed the most unconscionable scheme at the Assembly. He intends to purchase the old cotton warehouses along Broad Street, the ones in the district where the poorest families have lived for generations. He plans to evict every tenant, tear down the buildings, and erect a new commercial complex. The families will have nowhere to go, nowhere, and he is paying the city council members to ease the transaction, openly paying them, Eleanor. It is happening tonight. He will formalize the purchase agreement tonight at the governor's ball." Eleanor had set down her pen very carefully. She had asked Mrs. Henderson to repeat the information, to be absolutely certain of the details. Then she had listened to the woman speak about the injustice, the cruelty, the absolute perversity of allowing such a thing to proceed unopposed. After Mrs. Henderson had left, Eleanor sat alone in the library as the light began to fade, and she made a decision that no respectable woman in 1850s Charleston would ever make. She would face Nathaniel Hartwell. She would challenge him according to the code that governed men's honor. She would demand satisfaction. The law technically prohibited dueling. It had been made illegal throughout the United States generations ago. But in Charleston, in the South, among the planter class and the merchant princes, the code of honor still flourished in the shadows. Men killed each other over slights, over insults to their names and their families. It happened frequently enough that physicians kept their evening schedules open, and certain fields outside the city had earned grim reputations. A woman challenging a man to a duel was unprecedented. It was scandalous. It was impossible. Eleanor climbed the stairs to her father's study, a room she rarely entered, and found the dueling pistols mounted on the wall above his desk. They were beautiful things, crafted in Paris, with ivory handles carved into intricate patterns. Her father had purchased them on his honeymoon, before the children came, before he understood the true cost of honor. She took them down carefully, feeling the weight of them in her hands, understanding that she was not simply holding guns. She was holding her father's unfinished work. She was holding her family's reclaimed name. The letter she wrote to Nathaniel Hartwell was composed and elegant, delivered by a messenger the following morning. It contained no anger, no accusation. It simply stated facts. She had learned of his intentions regarding the warehouse district. She requested an immediate meeting to discuss his justification for displacing families from their homes. If he refused to meet with her, she would consider his refusal an admission of his guilt and a stain upon his honor. She would, therefore, have no choice but to issue a formal challenge. She signed it with her full name, Eleanor Marie Ashford. When his response arrived that afternoon, she found it almost disappointing in its brevity. Hartwell had written simply, "I will not dignify the impudent scrawling of a desperate woman with engagement or discussion. Whatever you believe you represent nothing. Your family is finished. You, Miss Ashford, are invisible." Eleanor read the letter 3 times, memorizing each cruel word. Then she sat at her father's desk and wrote her formal challenge. She worded it in the language of the Code Duello, using the precise terminology that governs such affairs. She demanded satisfaction for the destruction of her family's honor and for the callous betrayal of her father's trust. She named the stakes. If she prevailed, Hartwell would surrender his plans for the warehouse district and allow the families to remain. If he prevailed, she would yield her claim and disappear from Charleston entirely, never to speak of these matters again. The letter was delivered on an evening when the city was preparing for the autumn assembly. Eleanor stood at the library window and watched the sky turn from blue to purple to black, and she felt something settle within her chest. Not fear exactly, though fear was certainly present. It was something deeper, something that felt almost like peace. For the first time since her father's death, she understood exactly what she was meant to do. She understood the shape her life had been taking all these years. She had been preparing for this moment without knowing it. The news that Eleanor Ashford had challenged Nathaniel Hartwell to a duel spread through Charleston like fire through drought-stricken fields. It was impossible. It was scandalous. It was the most talked-about thing to happen in the city in decades. Women fainted at dinner tables. Ministers preached sermons about the corruption of female virtue. Newspapers published editorials debating whether such a challenge could be considered legitimate, whether the Code Duello could apply to a woman, whether society had not already fallen into such depravity that its collapse seemed inevitable. Eleanor received 3 visits from city officials on the morning following the public revelation of her challenge. The first official, a magistrate named Mr. Pemberton, explained that dueling was illegal and that she would be imprisoned if she proceeded. Eleanor offered him tea and listened politely to his warnings, then asked whether he intended to imprison Nathaniel Hartwell as well. Mr. Pemberton's face had colored, and he had left without finishing his tea. The second official was the city's chief constable, a man called Harper. He was younger and more sympathetic, and he actually explained his position with some dignity. He could not, he said, prevent the duel, Society was too powerful, the code too deeply entrenched. But he could offer her an alternative. He could protect her, arrange for her to leave the city, find her a position as a governess or a companion to an elderly lady somewhere far away. Somewhere she might have a life, however diminished. Eleanor thanked him and declined. The third official was surprising. The governor himself, a man of considerable power and moderate decency, named James Ormond. He did not come to threaten or persuade. He came to understand. "I knew your father," he said, sitting across from Eleanor in the library, with genuine sadness in his weathered face. "He was a good man. He was also a brave man, and I do not use that word lightly. When he discovered what Hartwell had done, he wanted to expose it properly, through legitimate channels, but those channels were already compromised. Hartwell had already bought the people who were meant to enforce justice. Your father understood in his final months that conventional means would never triumph against such power. I think perhaps he would understand what you are doing now." "He would disapprove," Eleanor said, but not with certainty. "Yes, probably," the governor agreed, "but he would understand. And in this moment, Eleanor, understanding is nearly everything." The governor did not attempt to stop the duel. What he did instead was quietly arrange for it to proceed with minimal interference. He ensured that the magistrates looked the other way. He made certain that the field outside the city would be empty of traffic on the appointed morning. He did not endorse Eleanor's actions. He could not, for his position would not allow it, but he made space for her to follow her conscience. Eleanor's seconds were a matter of some difficulty. Dueling etiquette required that each participant be accompanied by 2 seconds, men of honor, who would verify that the affair was conducted fairly, who would represent their principal's interests, who would step in to prevent the matter from becoming uncontrolled violence. It took Eleanor several days of careful conversations to find men willing to serve in such a capacity, to risk their own reputations by taking her part. The first was an elderly physician named Dr. Silas Vaughan, who had treated Eleanor's mother through her final illness, and who harbored a deep contempt for Nathaniel Hartwell. "I have lived 73 years, he told Eleanor, "and I have seen many things. But I have never seen a woman stand against a man so publicly, so completely. To refuse this would be to deny you your own agency. I will be your second, Miss Ashford, and I will do everything within the code to protect your interests." The second was more surprising. A lawyer named Robert Chambers, who had been one of Thomas Ashford's closest friends. Chambers had survived the scandal that destroyed Eleanor's father through a careful combination of silence and political maneuvering. But in his heart, he had never forgiven himself for his caution. In standing beside Eleanor, he was finally redeeming that old compromise. Nathaniel Hartwell's seconds were a marquee of power, a state senator and a federal judge, men so confident in their principal's victory that they seemed almost bored by the proceedings. There was 1 week before the duel. Eleanor spent it in extraordinary calm, moving through each day with a clarity that surprised even herself. She wrote letters to her closest friend, to the few remaining members of her extended family, to a solicitor who would handle her affairs should she die. She did not anticipate dying. She had studied the pistols for hours, had arranged for Dr. Vaughan to provide her instruction in their use. He had owned dueling pistols in his youth and remembered their operation quite well. She was a good shot. She was steady. She had no rage in her, only purpose. What she did fear was not death, but failure. If Hartwell defeated her, she would be bound by her agreement to leave Charleston entirely. The Warehouse families would lose their homes. Hartwell would consolidate his power even further, secure in the knowledge that no one, woman or man, would dare challenge him again. On the evening before the duel, Eleanor sat at her father's desk and read through his old notes about Hartwell's corruption, the evidence he had compiled, the frauds he had uncovered. She held each document up to the lamp and studied them carefully, committing details to memory. She thought about the families who would be displaced, the children who would have nowhere to sleep, the elderly people who had lived in those warehouses for decades. She thought about what it meant to act, even when the odds were uncertain, even when the cost was incalculable. She slept deeply that night without dreams. The morning of the duel arrived grey and cool, with a mist rising from the river that gave the world a dreamlike quality. Eleanor, dressed in simple dark clothing, a black skirt and a dark grey jacket, practical and austere. She pinned her hair carefully, every strand in place. She examined her face in the mirror and did not recognize herself. The woman looking back was harder than Eleanor remembered being, more resolved, more present in her own life. Dr. Vaughan and Robert Chambers arrived at dawn. Eleanor served them coffee while they reviewed the final details of the challenge with meticulous care. The duel would be conducted at a field owned by a neutral party, located 3 miles outside Charleston in the direction of the pine forests. The principals would stand 25 paces apart, as was standard. Each would be armed with 1 pistol, to be fired at the signal given by an independent witness. If both participants wished, they could fire simultaneously. If only one wished to fire, the other would be given an opportunity for a second shot. The affair would continue until one party was hit, or until both parties wished to end it, or until one party surrendered. The code was clear and ancient, refined through generations of Southern honor. Eleanor felt a strange comfort in its structures, its rules, its attempt to impose order on something inherently chaotic. "You understand," Dr. Vaughan said carefully, "that you can still choose not to go through with this. No shame would attach to you. Everyone would assume that circumstances prevented—" "Everyone would assume I was a coward," Eleanor interrupted gently. "I am many things, Dr. Vaughan, but I am not a coward." The carriage ride to the duel field seemed to take both an instant and several eternities. Eleanor watched the city fade behind them, watched the streets narrow into roads and the roads narrow into paths through the surrounding pine forest. She felt her heartbeat, steady and strong. She thought of her father. She thought of the families in the warehouses. She thought of the Duke, probably traveling toward this same field, probably secure in his certainty that he would triumph. The field itself was a place of terrible beauty, a clearing in the forest where morning light broke through the trees in long golden shafts. The mist was lifting, the world was becoming clear. Nathaniel Hartwell was already there, standing with his seconds, looking precisely as Eleanor had remembered. Tall, broad-shouldered, dressed impeccably in a light grey coat. He was in his 50s, handsome in a severe way, with silver threading through his dark hair. When he saw Eleanor emerge from her carriage, he made a sound. Was it laughter? Was it contempt? Eleanor could not decide. "This is madness," one of Hartwell's seconds said, stepping forward. "The lady must withdraw. This is not a legitimate affair of honor. It is a stunt." "It is precisely as legitimate as any duel," Robert Chambers responded. "Miss Ashford has issued a formal challenge. It has been accepted. The matter now proceeds according to the code." The independent witness, a planter of some reputation who had been selected by mutual agreement, stepped between the two principals. "You have both agreed to the terms. You will stand at the marked positions. When I drop my arm, you may fire. Do either of you wish to attempt a reconciliation before we proceed?" Eleanor and Hartwell stood perhaps 40 feet apart, facing each other across the mist-dampened grass. Eleanor was suddenly aware of how large he was, how powerful his frame appeared compared to her own lean body. She was aware of the weight of the pistol in her hand, the unfamiliar grip, the way her palms had gone slick with perspiration. But she was also aware of something else. She was not afraid. She was, in that moment, absolutely and completely alive. Eleanor and Nathaniel Hartwell approached the marked positions in the field as the morning mist continued its slow retreat toward the river. Eleanor's breathing was controlled, her movements measured. She had spent the entire night before the duel standing at the pistol range that Dr. Vaughan had created in the back garden of his house, firing repeatedly until her hands understood the weapon's characteristics, until her body could execute the motions without thought. 25 shots, each one striking the target with precision. She had felt nothing then but the mechanics of action, the translation of intention into reality. Now, standing on the field with a man who had systematically destroyed her family, she felt something more complex than mere mechanics could contain. Hartwell's face was a study in controlled fury. He had expected this affair to be laughable, to be a moment he could dismiss with the flick of his wrist. But standing here about to engage in an actual combat with a woman who would not flee, he seemed to be confronting the reality of what was transpiring. His seconds exchanged glances of uncertainty. "Final opportunity," the witness called out. "Does either principal wish to withdraw?" "I do not," Eleanor said clearly. Hartwell was silent for a long moment. Then, "I will not dignify this with withdrawal. Let us conclude this farce." Eleanor moved to her position, feeling the grass beneath her feet, the cool morning air on her face. She raised her pistol, feeling the weight of it, the geometry of it. She had learned from Dr. Vaughan that the key to accurate shooting lay not in force or anger, but in stillness. One must become, for just a moment, absolutely present and absolutely empty of everything except the intention to hit the target. Nathaniel Hartwell stood across from her, his pistol raised, his face now a mask of cold determination. Eleanor found herself wondering what he was thinking, what calculations he was making. Did he believe he would win? Did he even now underestimate her completely? Or did he sense in her something he had not anticipated? "On my signal," the witness said. Eleanor did not think about the families. She did not think about her father. She did not think about failure or success or the consequences of the next moments. She thought only about the space between herself and Hartwell, about the trajectory a bullet would need to travel, about the point of aim that would translate her will into reality. The witness's arm began to descend. Both Eleanor and Hartwell fired simultaneously. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing. The gunshots cracked across the field like thunder, and the birds scattered from the trees in a startled cloud. The smell of gunpowder filled the air. Eleanor had no consciousness of what her own shot had accomplished. She was already reloading, her hands moving through the motions Dr. Vaughan had taught her, inserting powder, tamping the ball, preparing for a second shot. It was Hartwell who moved first. He stumbled sideways, his hand going to his left shoulder. Blood bloomed through his grey coat, spreading outward from where Eleanor's bullet had entered. For a moment he simply stared at the wound, as if unable to comprehend that he had been hit. Then he raised his pistol for another shot. "He's still armed," Dr. Vaughan called out sharply, and Eleanor realized that according to the code, they could continue. Both principals had fired. Neither was dead. The matter was not concluded. Eleanor aimed quickly and fired a second time. This shot went through Hartwell's right leg, between the hip and the knee. He cried out, a sound of genuine pain and shock, and fell heavily to the grass. The pistol dropped from his hand, and he lay there, bleeding, staring up at the sky as if it had betrayed him. "The duel is concluded," the independent witness called out. "Miss Ashford stands victorious. The code is satisfied." Dr. Vaughan rushed to Eleanor, but she barely felt his hands on her arm. She was staring at Nathaniel Hartwell, who was staring up at the sky, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His seconds were moving toward him now, trying to assess the severity of his wounds. Eleanor could hear them calling for bandages, for a carriage, for a physician. She had shot him. She had done exactly what she set out to do, and now, she realized, everything would change. Over the course of the following days, the news of the duel's outcome spread through Charleston like nothing had ever spread before. A woman had challenged a man to a duel and had won. Not only had she won, she had done so with extraordinary precision, with a coolness and a skill that seemed almost supernatural to observers who had only known women as delicate creatures to be protected and sheltered. The city fractured in its response. Some people, particularly those who had suffered at Hartwell's hands, whose businesses had been ruined or whose families had been exploited, quietly celebrated. There were whispers in the taverns and in the parlours of sympathetic households. Eleanor Ashford had done what the law could not do. She had held the powerful accountable, but others were horrified. Ministers preached about the corruption of womanly virtue. Newspaper editorials warned of the dangers of allowing the fairer sex to possess weapons and claim for themselves the privileges of honor. Women of respectable families were forbidden from associating with Eleanor. Her name was struck from guest lists. The friends who had once taken her needlework stopped calling. Nathaniel Hartwell survived his wounds. The bullet that had entered his shoulder had missed the major arteries, but had destroyed some of the soft tissue and would cause him pain for the rest of his life. The shot to his leg had shattered the femur, and he would walk with a pronounced limp, if he walked at all. The physician said he would likely need a cane to support his weight, possibly 2 canes. His primary arm, his right arm, had been spared, but his left shoulder meant that certain activities would be forever closed to him. More importantly, his power had been shattered in ways that gunpowder alone could not accomplish. Within a week of the duel, the agreements he had made with the city council regarding the warehouse properties were nullified. The councilmen, suddenly courageous in their conscience, voted unanimously to reject his purchase proposal. The families in the warehouses were safe. The homes they had occupied for decades would not be torn down. They would not be displaced. Hartwell attempted to sue for breach of contract. The courts, it turned out, were less inclined to support his interests without the backing of the powerful public opinion that had previously sustained him. He lost the case. His reputation, already wounded, deteriorated further, but Eleanor paid a price as well. Society had not forgiven her, no matter that her action had prevented a tremendous injustice. She was not welcomed in respectable homes. Her teaching positions had been rescinded. The letters she received were primarily from people who despised her or who were curious about her in the manner of someone observing a curiosity in a museum. Yet something strange had happened in the days following her victory. Eleanor had received visitors, women primarily, though some men as well, who came quietly, often in the evening when fewer people would see them arriving. They came to listen to her story. They came to understand how it was possible for someone so seemingly powerless to act with such consequences. They came to take courage from her example, even if that courage might never manifest in such extreme action. One evening, a young woman came to the library, a girl of perhaps 17, wearing a borrowed cloak that did not quite fit her frame. Her name was Sarah, and she had traveled from 2 towns away specifically to see Eleanor. "I came because I wanted to know," Sarah had said, sitting on the edge of one of the library chairs as if she might need to flee at any moment, "whether you were happy, whether you regret what you did." Eleanor had considered this question carefully. Was she happy? She was certainly not comfortable. She was certainly not welcomed. Her life had become, if anything, more restricted than it had been before. She could no longer move through Charleston society with the minimal acceptance she had once possessed. She had become a cautionary tale, a warning of what happened when women stepped outside their prescribed roles. "I do not regret it," Eleanor had answered finally. "But neither is it simple to say that I am happy. What I am is fulfilled. I acted according to my conscience. I faced the consequences of that action. I did not flinch, and I did not fail. That is worth something." "It is worth everything," Sarah had said, with the intensity of youth. Then she had leaned forward and asked a question that would echo through Eleanor's mind for years. "What should I do? I live in a home where my father is destroying the lives of workers on his plantation. Everyone says I should simply accept this as the way of things. But you showed me that acceptance is not required. What should I do?" Eleanor had not answered immediately. She understood that what she said in that moment might influence a young woman's entire life. She understood that she bore a responsibility not to encourage recklessness, not to suggest that dramatic actions were always necessary or right. "I cannot tell you what you should do," Eleanor had said finally. "I can only tell you that you do have choices, even if those choices are constrained. You are not as powerless as the world would have you believe. Find the place where your conscience is clearest. Find the action that you can live with. Find what is actually within your power, rather than wishing for power you do not possess. And if you find an action that is right, the fact that it is difficult should not prevent you." In the weeks following the duel, the Ashford house had transformed. Eleanor's small library had become an informal gathering place for those who sought her counsel, who wanted to understand her, who were themselves seeking the courage to act against injustice in whatever form it manifested in their own lives. The city had not forgiven her, but gradually something else had happened. Eleanor Ashford, who had been invisible, had become unavoidable. She was still ignored by respectable society, but she was no longer invisible. She had become, in the language of the day, a legend.